I was on my way to my parents' house for Christmas Eve dinner. The highway stretched out ahead, mostly empty except for a few other cars probably heading to their own family gatherings. It was starting to get dark, and a light snow was falling, making everything look like a scene from a holiday card. I'd been driving for about 2 hours when my car started making this weird noise. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the road or maybe some ice building up somewhere. But then the engine started to sputter, and I knew something was wrong. I managed to pull over to the side of the road just as the car gave out completely. I sat there for a minute trying to restart it, but nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Great, just what I needed on Christmas Eve. I got out to take a look under the hood, but I'm no mechanic. Everything looked normal to me, but then again, I wouldn't know if something was wrong unless it was on fire or missing. I tried calling for help, but of course there was no cell service out here in the middle of nowhere. So there I was, stuck on the side of the highway as it got darker and colder. I could see my breath in the air, and the snow was starting to come down harder. I kept trying to flag down passing cars, but they just zoomed by. I guess nobody wanted to stop on a snowy night to help a stranger. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 45 minutes, I saw headlights approaching slower than the others. As they got closer, I realized it was a van, and it was pulling over. I felt this rush of relief. Finally, someone was stopping to help. The van came to a stop a little way ahead of my car. It was one of those big white cargo vans, the kind plumbers or electricians use. I watched as the driver's door opened, and a man got out. He was tall and kind of bulky, wearing a heavy winter coat and a baseball cap. He called out asking if I needed help. I explained that my car had broken down and asked if he had a phone I could use to call for a tow. He said he didn't, but he offered to take a look at my car. I was grateful for any help at this point, so I agreed. As he walked towards me, something felt off. I can't explain it, but there was this tension in the air. Maybe it was just because I was alone on a dark road with a stranger, but my instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. He got closer, and that's when I noticed it. There was something dark on his hands. At first, I thought it might be grease or oil, from working on cars. But as he got nearer, I realized with growing horror that it was red. It was blood. My mind started racing. I tried to tell myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he cut himself earlier. Maybe he was a hunter. But then I glanced past him to the van, and through the windshield, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shape in the back of the van. It was large and wrapped in something dark, but I could make out what looked like a human form. An arm was sticking out from under the covering, pale and lifeless. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. I could hear my own breathing, loud and fast. The man was only a few feet away now, reaching out towards me with those blood-stained hands. His face, friendly just moments ago, now looked sinister in the fading light. I didn't think. I just reacted. I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the woods on the side of the highway. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, branches whipping at my face, my feet slipping on the snow-covered ground. I ran until I couldn't breathe. Then I stumbled deeper into the woods. It was almost completely dark now, and I was terrified of making noise. Every snap of a twig made me freeze. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath and listen for any sounds of pursuit. Time seemed to stand still in that forest. I was shivering, partly from the cold and partly from fear. I kept imagining I could hear footsteps or see shadows moving between the trees. My phone was useless, no signal, and the battery dying quickly in the cold. I don't know how long I stayed there. Hours, probably. The snow kept falling, and I was starting to worry about freezing to death. But the thought of that van and what I saw in it kept me rooted to the spot. Eventually, I heard a sound that made my heart leap. Sirens. They were distant at first, but getting closer. I wanted to run towards them, but I was scared it might be a trick. What if he had called for backup? What if there were more of them? The sirens got louder, and I could see flashing lights through the trees. I heard voices calling out, but I was still too scared to respond. It wasn't until I heard them say they were state police that I finally found the courage to call back. When they found me, I was a mess. Cold, scratched up, and barely able to speak. They wrapped me in a blanket and led me out of the woods. As we emerged onto the highway, I saw multiple police cars and an ambulance. My car was still there, but the van was gone. I told them everything. About the van, the man with blood on his hands, what I saw in the back. They took my statement and started a search, but I don't know if they ever found anything. All I know is that I'm alive, and I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't trusted my instincts and run when I did, I might have ended up like whatever was in the back of that van. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. Last Christmas, I was driving to my sister's place in Vermont. She just had a baby, and I wanted to surprise them with some gifts. The roads were pretty empty, which made sense since it was Christmas Day. Most people were probably already with their families, opening presents or having dinner. I'd been on the road for about 4 hours when I realized I was running low on gas. The fuel light had just come on, and I knew I needed to find a station soon. I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forests and small mountains. The sky was gray and a light snow was starting to fall. As I drove, I kept an eye out for any signs of civilization. It felt like forever before I finally saw a small town coming up. It wasn't much, just a few buildings clustered together off the main road. I spotted a gas station on the outskirts and felt relieved. The place looked old and a bit run down, but beggars can't be choosers, right? I pulled into the station. There was only one pump, and it looked like it was from the 1970s. The whole place had this eerie, abandoned feel to it. I didn't see anyone around, not even in the small convenience store attached to the station. For a moment, I wondered if it was even open. But then I saw movement inside the store. A figure appeared behind the grimy windows, and I figured it must be the attendant. I got out of my car and started to pump the gas. It was cold, and the wind was picking up, making the snow swirl around me. I just wanted to fill up and get back on the road as quickly as possible. As I was pumping the gas, the store's door opened. The attendant came out, and something about him immediately made me uneasy. He was a tall, thin man with greasy hair and pale skin. His eyes, there was something off about them. They seemed too wide, too intense. He was wearing a dirty uniform that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. The attendant started walking towards me, and I noticed he had a slight limp. He called out, asking if I needed help. I politely declined, saying I was almost done, but he kept coming closer. I could smell him now, a mix of body odor and something metallic. My instincts were screaming at me that something wasn't right. He reached my car and stood uncomfortably close. I tried to focus on the pump, avoiding eye contact. But then he started talking, his voice low and raspy. He kept insisting that I should come inside the store. He said he had fresh coffee, snacks, maps, anything I might need for my trip. With each offer, his voice got more insistent, almost desperate. I kept refusing, making excuses about being in a hurry. But he wouldn't let up. He started talking about the weather, how it was going to get worse, how dangerous the roads were. He said I really should come inside and wait it out. The way he said it didn't sound like concern. It sounded like a threat. I finished pumping the gas and tried to move towards the driver's side door, but the attendant shifted, blocking my path. He was so close now I could see the dirt under his fingernails and a dark stain on his shirt that looked disturbingly like dried blood. That's when he changed tactics. He started asking personal questions. Where was I going? Was I meeting family? Was anyone expecting me? Each question made my skin crawl. I gave vague answers, trying to end the conversation, but he kept pushing. I managed to edge around him and get to my car door. I opened it, ready to jump in, when suddenly he grabbed my arm. His grip was incredibly strong, his fingers digging into my skin. He started pulling me towards the store, saying there was something he needed to show me inside. In that moment, pure terror took over. I yanked my arm free and practically dove into my car. I could hear him yelling something, but I didn't wait to find out what. I started the engine and floored it, tires squealing as I peeled out of the station. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The attendant was standing in the middle of the road watching my car disappear. Even from that distance, I could see the look on his face. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was disappointment. Like a predator watching its prey escape. I drove for miles without slowing down, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Every car I passed, every shadow on the road made me jump. I was convinced he was somehow following me. It wasn't until I reached a larger town that I finally felt safe enough to stop. I pulled into a busy parking lot of a shopping center and just sat there trying to calm down. That's when I noticed my phone buzzing. I had several missed calls and messages. They were all from my sister asking where I was and if I was okay. When I called her back, she was frantic. She asked if I had stopped at a gas station in a small town called Milton. When I said yes, she burst into tears. She told me that the local news had just reported a breakthrough in a series of disappearances in the area. They had traced the missing person's last known locations to various gas stations along the highway. The police had just released a description of a suspect, a gas station attendant who was believed to be a serial killer. The description matched the man I had encountered perfectly. They think he had been using his job to target travelers, especially during holidays when people were more likely to be driving alone. As my sister talked, I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me. I realized how close I had come to becoming another victim. If I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I had gone into that store, I might have never made it to my sister's house. I might have become just another missing person, another unsolved case. We were driving to my parents' house for Christmas Eve. The kids were in the back talking about presents and cookies. It was snowing lightly, typical for December in Colorado. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the snow got heavier. I had to slow down, and the windshield wipers were barely keeping up. The road narrowed and visibility dropped to almost nothing. I thought about turning back, but we were already more than halfway there. I figured we'd push through and be at my parents' soon. That's when it happened. A strong gust of wind hit the car, and we started sliding. I tried to control it, but we spun around and ended up half on the road, half in a snowbank. I tried to drive out, but the wheels just spun. We were stuck. When I got out to check, the cold hit me hard. The wind was howling, and I could barely see the back of our car through the snow. This was serious trouble. Back in the car, I told the kids we'd have to wait out the storm. They looked scared, and I was too. I tried to call for help, but there was no cell service. We were on our own, miles from anywhere. The temperature dropped fast as it got dark. I could see my breath inside the car. I had the kids put on all the extra clothes we had and covered them with our picnic blanket. We huddled in the back seat, trying to stay warm. I ran the car in short bursts for heat, worried about running out of gas. Each time I turned it off, the cold crept in faster. The windows were freezing on the inside, and I had to keep scraping them to see out. That's when we heard the first howl. Distant at first, but then another. Closer. Wolves. I'd heard there were wolves in these mountains, but now they seemed very real and very dangerous. The kids asked about the noise, and I lied, saying it was just the wind. They didn't believe me. We sat in silence, listening to the howls get closer. I wondered if the wolves could smell us, if they'd try to get into the car. The night got colder and colder. The kids were shivering despite the layers and blanket. I kept rubbing their hands and feet, trying to keep blood flowing. I checked my phone constantly, hoping for a signal, but nothing. The howling got closer, and I swear I saw shapes moving in the snow outside. Dark, four-legged shapes. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I knew better. The car battery died in the middle of the night. We lost our clock, our last source of light. The darkness was complete, broken only by occasional lightning flashes that lit up the snowy world for a second. The kids stopped talking. They were pressed against me, shaking. I was shaking too, so cold it hurt. My thoughts were getting fuzzy, and I had to fight to stay awake. I knew falling asleep could be deadly. I started talking nonstop, telling stories, making the kids respond, move their fingers and toes, anything to keep us all awake and our blood flowing. My voice was hoarse, my words slurring from the cold, but I kept going. The wolves were so close now. Their howls had turned to low growls. I could hear them moving around the car, sniffing, scratching at the doors. The kids were crying silently. I held them tight, praying the car's metal would keep us safe. Time lost all meaning. It felt like days, though it couldn't have been more than hours. The cold had seeped into my bones. I couldn't feel my feet. The kids had stopped shivering, and I knew that was bad. I tried to think of ways to signal for help, but everything needed power we didn't have. I considered trying to walk for help, but knew I'd never make it in this storm, and I couldn't leave the kids. So we waited, hoping someone would find us before it was too late. As the night wore on, the storm's intensity varied. Sometimes it would ease up a bit, giving us a false hope that it was ending, only to come back stronger. During one of these lulls, I thought I heard a distant rumble, different from the wind or wolves. I strained to listen, but it faded away. Was it a snowplow, a rescue vehicle, or just my desperate mind playing tricks? The wolves seemed to come and go. Sometimes their howls were distant, and I'd relax a little. Then they'd be right outside the car again, and the fear would come rushing back. I found myself watching the windows, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I tried to keep track of time by counting, but I kept losing my place. The periods of darkness between lightning flashes seemed to stretch longer and longer, or maybe that was just my perception as exhaustion set in. At some point I realized I was hallucinating. I saw shapes in the car that weren't there, heard voices whispering. I knew it wasn't real, but that almost made it worse. How long before I couldn't tell the difference between reality and hallucination? The kids drifted in and out of consciousness. Each time one of them got too quiet, I'd shake them, make them talk to me. My own voice sounded strange in my ears, far away and distorted. I thought about my parents, probably worried sick by now, about the Christmas dinner getting cold, the presents sitting unopened. I thought about all the things I should have done differently, should have checked the weather more carefully, should have left earlier, should have turned back when the snow got bad. The cold was unbearable. It felt like it was crushing me, squeezing the life out of us. I couldn't remember what it felt like to be warm. Had we ever been warm? It seemed like we'd been in this car, in this cold, forever. Just when I thought we couldn't hold on any longer, something changed. The wind's howl softened, and the snow's fury seemed to lessen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the sky began to lighten. The long night was finally ending. As dawn broke, I could see the extent of our situation. The car was nearly buried in snow. The road was invisible under a thick white blanket, but the storm had passed and the sky was clearing. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of an engine. A snowplow appeared on the road, followed by a rescue vehicle. They'd been searching the mountain roads for stranded travelers like us. Within minutes, they reached our car and got us out. I was driving back from my family's place on Christmas night. The roads were pretty empty, just a few cars here and there. It had started snowing lightly, and I was taking it slow, watching the flakes dance in my headlights. I'd done this drive 100 times before, but something felt off that night. About an hour into my trip, I saw headlights swerving wildly in my rearview mirror. Before I could react, the car behind me spun out of control and crashed into the guardrail. The sound of metal crunching and tires screeching filled the air. I pulled over immediately, my instincts kicking in to help. As I got out of my car, the cold hit me hard. The snow was coming down heavier now, and I could barely make out the wreckage through the swirling white. I called out, asking if anyone was hurt, but there was no response. Just the hiss of steam rising from the crumpled hood. I approached the car cautiously, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The driver's side door was dented inward, and I couldn't see anyone inside through the fogged-up windows. I tapped on the glass, trying to get a response. That's when I heard movement from inside. The door creaked open slowly, and I leaned in to help. But as soon as I saw the driver's face, I froze. It was my ex-husband. The same man who had made my life hell for years, the one I'd finally escaped from. He looked dazed for a moment, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Then his eyes focused on me, and I saw the recognition dawn on his face. In that split second, I knew I was in danger. His expression changed from confusion to rage in an instant. He lunged forward, grabbing for me, but I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the icy road. That's when I saw the tire iron in his hand. He must have grabbed it when he realized it was me. I didn't think. I just ran. I heard him shouting behind me, his voice filled with the same anger I'd lived in fear of for so long. The sound of his heavy footsteps crunching in the snow spurred me on. I couldn't go back to my car. He was between me and it. The only option was the dark forest on the other side of the road. I plunged into the trees, branches whipping at my face as I ran. The snow was deeper here, and each step was a struggle. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, getting closer. My lungs burned from the cold air and my legs ached, but fear kept me moving. The forest was pitch black. The only light came from the occasional break in the clouds, the moon casting eerie shadows through the bare trees. I had no idea where I was going, just away from him. Every sound made me jump. Was that him getting closer or just snow falling from a branch? I stumbled over hidden roots and rocks, barely keeping my balance. At one point I slipped and fell hard, the snow cushioning my fall but soaking through my clothes. I scrambled to my feet, hearing him shout. He was closer now. I could make out his words, threats that made my blood run cold. I pushed on, my wet clothes freezing in the bitter wind. My fingers were numb and I could barely feel my feet. But I knew if I stopped, it would be over. I tried to move as quietly as possible, hoping to lose him in the darkness. But the snow betrayed me, crunching under every step. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I came to a small clearing. The moonlight reflected off the snow, making it bright enough to see. I paused for a second, trying to catch my breath and figure out which way to go. That's when I heard a branch snap behind me. I whirled around to see my ex-husband at the edge of the clearing, tire iron raised. He was breathing hard, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His eyes were wild, filled with a hatred I knew all too well. He started towards me and I backed away, looking for any escape. That's when I noticed the ground sloping away behind me. Without thinking, I turned and ran, hoping to find a way down. But the slope was steeper than I thought. I lost my footing and started sliding down the hill, picking up speed. Snow and ice flew into my face as I tumbled, unable to stop. I came to a jarring halt at the bottom. The wind knocked out of me. For a moment I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. Then I heard him yelling from the top of the hill. He was making his way down, more carefully than I had. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the pain, and started running again. The trees were thicker here and I used them for cover, weaving between the trunks. I could hear him stumbling behind me, cursing as he tried to keep up. The tire iron clanged against the trees as he swung it wildly, the sound echoing through the forest. I was losing strength fast. The cold and fear had drained me and each step was a struggle. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. That's when I saw a faint light through the trees. It looked like a cabin or a house. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I changed direction, heading for the light. The snow seemed to get deeper, and each step was like wading through quicksand. I could hear my ex getting closer, his shouts becoming clearer. I pushed harder, my legs burning with the effort. As I broke through the tree line, I saw it was indeed a cabin. The windows were dark, but there was a porch light on. I sprinted for the door, praying it would be unlocked. Behind me, I heard my ex yell triumphantly. He thought he had me cornered. I reached the porch and grabbed the door handle, twisting it desperately. It was locked. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The cabin was empty. I turned to see my ex emerging from the trees, a twisted smile on his face. He thought he had won. But as he stepped into the clearing, bright lights suddenly flooded the area. We both froze, momentarily blinded. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a police siren. A voice on a loudspeaker ordered my ex to drop his weapon and get on the ground. 2 police officers approached cautiously, guns drawn. My ex, realizing he was cornered, dropped the tire iron and fell to his knees. As one officer handcuffed him, the other came to check on me. He explained they had gotten reports of an abandoned vehicle on the highway and had been searching the area. They had seen the lights of the cabin and decided to check it out. The GPS said to turn right, so I did. It was Christmas Eve and I was making my last delivery for the day. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. Trees closed in on both sides, their bare branches scraping against my car. I should have known something was off when I lost cell service, but I kept going. The package in my passenger seat needed to be delivered, and I wanted to get home for the holidays. The road got narrower, muddier. My tires started to spin, struggling for traction. I slowed down, hoping to find a spot to turn around, but there was nothing. Just endless trees and deepening mud. Then, with a sickening lurch, my car stopped moving forward. The wheels spun uselessly, digging deeper into the muck. I tried reversing, but that only made it worse. The car settled deeper, tilting slightly to one side. I got out to assess the situation, my shoes immediately sinking into the cold mud. The forest was silent. No birds, no wind. Just the ticking of my cooling engine and my own breathing. I circled the car, looking for anything I could use to get traction. Nothing but leaves and twigs. As I rounded the back of the car, movement caught my eye. I froze, squinting into the dim forest. There it was again, a shadow moving between the trees. Then another, and another. They emerged slowly from the woods. 3 men, then 5, all carrying rifles. They spread out, surrounding my car. I stood there, mud sucking at my feet as they approached. Their faces were hard, weathered, eyes cold and suspicious. One of them, a tall man with a gray beard, stepped forward. He demanded to know why I was on their property. His voice was gruff, hostile. I stammered out an explanation about the delivery, the GPS. He cut me off, asking who sent me. I tried to show him the package, but he barked at me to stay still. The other men moved closer, their rifles not quite pointed at me, but not pointed away either. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold. The bearded man fired off more questions. Who was I working for? Was I alone? What was really in the package? I answered as calmly as I could, trying to keep my voice steady. I explained about my job, the Christmas deliveries. I offered to open the package to show them it was just a gift. The bearded man hesitated, then nodded to one of the others. A younger man with a scar across his cheek approached, rifle trained on me, and took the package. He ripped it open roughly. Inside was a wooden music box. He wound it up and a tinny Christmas carol played. The men exchanged glances. The bearded man's eyes narrowed. He asked how I knew about this road, why my GPS had sent me here. I tried to explain about mapping errors, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. The questioning continued. They wanted to know about my route, other deliveries I'd made. They asked about specific addresses, names I'd never heard. With each answer, their frustration seemed to grow. The bearded man conferred with the others in low voices. I caught words like scout and infiltrator. Time stretched on. The forest grew darker. I was shivering now from cold and fear. My legs ached from standing in the mud, but I didn't dare move. The men's expressions grew more hostile. One suggested searching my car. Another wanted to take this somewhere more private. I felt panic rising. I pleaded with them, insisted I was just lost, just trying to do my job. I talked about my family waiting for me, about Christmas dinner getting cold, anything to make them see me as a person, not a threat. The bearded man watched me silently, his eyes never leaving my face. Suddenly, a distant engine sound cut through the air. The men tensed, heads turning towards the noise. It was growing louder, coming closer. The bearded man barked out orders. 2 men melted back into the forest, the others repositioned using my car as cover. The engine noise got louder, then stopped. There was a moment of tense silence. Then a voice called out from down the road. The bearded man responded, his tone cautious. More voices, a brief exchange I couldn't make out. The tension in the air was palpable. Footsteps approached. A new figure emerged from the gloom. An older woman, her face lined and stern. She walked right up to the bearded man, ignoring me completely. They spoke in low, urgent tones. I caught fragments. Not the guy. False alarm. Clean this up. The woman turned to me, her gaze piercing. She asked one question. Did I know where I was? I shook my head, tried to explain again about the GPS error. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded to the bearded man. The atmosphere shifted. The men lowered their rifles. The bearded man approached me, his manner brusque but no longer openly hostile. He told me I'd wandered onto private property, a mistake that could have ended badly. They were going to let me go, but I needed to leave immediately and never come back. Two of the men helped push my car out of the mud. As soon as the wheels found traction, the bearded man ordered me to drive. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just go. I didn't need to be told twice. I got in, turned the car around, and drove. I was driving to my sister's place for Christmas, just a normal cross-country trip I'd done plenty of times before. It was late, and I'd been on the road for hours. The highways were pretty empty, just a few cars and the occasional big rig passing by. My eyes were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to stop soon or I'd risk falling asleep at the wheel. I spotted a sign for a 24-hour diner coming up and decided to pull in. The parking lot was mostly empty. Just a couple of semis and a few cars. The diner itself was one of those retro-style places, all chrome and neon. As I walked in, the bell above the door jingled, and the smell of coffee and grease hit me. There were only a handful of people inside. A tired-looking waitress behind the counter, an old guy nursing a coffee at one end of the bar, and two truckers in a booth near the back. I slid into a booth on the opposite side of the diner and ordered a coffee and a burger. While I was waiting for my food, I couldn't help but overhear bits and pieces of the truckers' conversation. At first, it was just normal stuff, complaining about long hours, bad weather, that kind of thing. But then their voices got lower, and I caught something that made me sit up straight. One of them mentioned the RV at the next rest stop and easy pickings. The other one laughed and said something about how they'd be set for months after this job. I tried not to look like I was listening, but my mind was racing. Were they really planning to rob someone? I ate my food quickly, trying to decide what to do. Should I call the police? But I didn't have any real proof, just snippets of a conversation I'd overheard. Maybe I'd misunderstood. I paid my bill and headed out to my car, glancing back at the truckers as I left. They were still deep in conversation. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. But after a few miles, I realized the truck was keeping pace with me, staying a consistent distance behind. I sped up a little, and so did they. I slowed down, and they matched my speed. My hands were starting to sweat on the steering wheel. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to take the next exit, thinking I'd stop at a gas station and let them pass. As I turned off the highway, the truck followed. The exit led to a small town, empty and dark at this late hour. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the night. I pulled in, hoping to see the truck continue past. Instead, it turned in right behind me. I parked at one of the pumps, my heart pounding. The truck pulled up on the other side, blocking me in. Two men got out, the same two from the diner. They were both big guys, one with a beard and the other with a bandana tied around his head. They started walking towards my car. I locked the doors and reached for my phone, but before I could dial, the bearded one was at my window. He tapped on the glass with something metal. A gun, I realized with a jolt of terror. He gestured for me to roll down the window. With shaking hands, I lowered the window just a crack. The bearded man leaned in close. He said he'd seen me at the diner and wanted to know if I'd overheard their conversation. I tried to deny it, but he cut me off. He knew I'd heard, and now I had a choice to make. I could come with them quietly and everything would be fine, or I could try to be a hero and things would get ugly. The way he said it, the cold look in his eyes. I knew he wasn't bluffing. I nodded, too scared to speak. They made me move to the passenger seat. The bearded one got behind the wheel, while his partner followed in their truck. As we pulled out of the gas station, I saw the attendant inside, oblivious to what was happening. We drove for what felt like hours. The bearded man kept the gun in his lap, a constant reminder of the danger I was in. He didn't say much, just occasional directions to his partner in the truck behind us. I stared out the window, watching the unfamiliar landscape roll by, wondering if I'd ever see my family again. At some point, I gathered the courage to ask where we were going. The bearded man glanced at me, then back at the road. He said we were headed to the rest stop where their job was. Once it was done, if I'd behaved, they'd let me go. I didn't believe him, but I nodded anyway. As we drove, I tried to memorize details, road signs, landmarks, anything that might help later if I managed to escape. But it was dark, and we were on back roads I didn't recognize. I felt completely lost and helpless. The bearded man must have noticed me looking around because he warned me not to try anything stupid. He said his partner in the truck behind us wouldn't hesitate to run me down if I tried to escape. The casual way he said it made my blood run cold. We passed through small towns and stretches of empty farmland. Each time we approached civilization, I hoped someone would notice something was wrong. But in the dark, we were just another car on the road. No one had any idea of the nightmare happening inside. As the night wore on, the bearded man became more talkative. He started explaining their plan, almost bragging about it. They'd been tracking this RV for days, he said. The owners were an elderly couple who'd just won big at a casino. They were carrying all their winnings in cash. I listened in horror as he laid out the details of the robbery. They'd studied the couple's routine, knew when they'd be at the rest stop. It was all so calculated, so cold. I realized then that these weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were experienced criminals. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we turned off the highway onto a smaller road. Up ahead, I could see the lights of a rest stop. My heart started racing again. I knew that whatever was going to happen, it would happen soon. As we pulled into the rest stop, I saw the RV parked at the far end. There were a few other vehicles around, a couple of cars, another big rig. The bearded man parked a little way away from the RV and turned to me. He said I was to stay in the car and keep quiet. If I made a sound or tried to warn anyone, his partner wouldn't hesitate to use his gun. I watched, helpless, as they got out of the vehicles and walked towards the RV. They moved with purpose, like they'd done this before. I looked around desperately for anyone who might help, but the rest stop was quiet. Everyone else was asleep in their vehicles or inside the building. As the two men approached the RV, something unexpected happened. The door of the RV swung open, and a man stepped out. He was younger than I expected, definitely not the elderly man they'd described. He looked alert, not like someone who'd just been woken up. The bearded man and his partner hesitated. I could see the confusion in their body language. Then suddenly, more car doors opened. People started getting out, not sleepy travelers, but alert, purposeful individuals. I counted at least 5 of them. The 2 would-be robbers started backing away. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see the panic on their faces. They turned and started running back towards the vehicles. As they did, I heard shouts and saw flashes of light. Flashlights, I realized. The people from the other vehicles were chasing them. In that moment of chaos, I made a split-second decision. I scrambled over to the driver's seat and started the car. The bearded man was almost at the car, running full tilt. But before he could reach me, I slammed the car into drive and floored it. It was Christmas morning, and I was on my way to my sister's place. The roads were pretty empty, just a few cars here and there. It had snowed overnight, leaving a thin layer of white on the fields beside the highway. I was making good time, thinking about the big family dinner we'd have later. About an hour into my drive, I noticed a guy on the side of the road. He was bundled up in a thick coat, his thumb out, trying to catch a ride. Normally, I wouldn't stop for hitchhikers, but it was Christmas and the guy looked like he was freezing out there. I slowed down and pulled over. As I stopped, I got a better look at him. He was a scruffy-looking guy, maybe in his 30s, with a patchy beard and tired eyes. He had a small backpack with him. When I rolled down the window, he asked if I could give him a ride to the next town. I hesitated for a moment, but then I thought, it's Christmas. What's the worst that could happen? So I told him to hop in. He got in the car and immediately I was hit by the smell of cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. He thanked me for stopping and said he'd been out there for hours. I asked him where he was headed, and he mumbled something about visiting family. As we started driving, I noticed he kept fidgeting with his backpack, keeping it close to him. For the first few miles, things were okay. We made small talk about the weather and Christmas plans, but something felt off. He kept looking in the rearview mirror like he was checking if someone was following us. His answers to my questions were vague and sometimes didn't make sense. I started to regret my decision to pick him up. Then, out of nowhere, he told me to take the next exit. I explained that it wasn't on my way, but he insisted. That's when I saw the knife. He'd pulled it out of his jacket pocket, and now he was holding it where I could see it. My stomach dropped. He said if I didn't do what he said, things would get ugly. I took the exit, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. He directed me through a series of turns, taking us further away from the highway and into an area I didn't know. We ended up on a narrow road lined with old warehouses and abandoned factories. The whole time he kept that knife pointed at me, warning me not to try anything stupid. Finally, he told me to stop in front of a massive, rusted warehouse. The windows were boarded up and the whole place looked like it hadn't been used in years. He made me get out of the car, keeping the knife pressed against my back as we walked towards a side door. Inside, the warehouse was huge and empty, just concrete floors and metal support beams stretching up to a high ceiling. Our footsteps echoed in the vast space. He marched me towards the back of the building, where there was a small office area. The whole time I was trying to figure out what he wanted, why he had brought me here. In the office, he ordered me to sit in a chair while he paced back and forth, muttering to himself. I could see he was agitated, constantly checking his watch and peering out the grimy windows. It seemed like he was waiting for something or someone. As time passed, he got more and more anxious. He started rummaging through drawers in the old desk, cursing when he didn't find whatever he was looking for. I sat there, terrified, watching his every move, afraid that any moment he might turn that knife on me. Then suddenly there was a noise from outside, a car engine. He rushed to the window, forgetting about me for a moment. That's when I saw my chance. I bolted from the chair and ran as fast as I could. I heard him yell and the sound of his footsteps behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran. I burst out of the warehouse into the cold air. My car was still there, but I didn't dare go for it. Instead, I ran down the street, turning randomly, just trying to put as much distance between me and him as possible. I could hear him shouting somewhere behind me, but his voice was getting fainter. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. I was in some kind of industrial area, surrounded by more warehouses and factories. There wasn't a person in sight, and I couldn't hear any traffic. I started walking, hoping to find a main road or someone who could help. But the area seemed deserted. Every building I passed was abandoned or closed for the holiday. The few cars I saw were all parked and empty. I tried to use my phone, but there was no signal. As I wandered, the sky started to darken. I was cold, tired, and scared out of my mind. Every sound made me jump, thinking it might be him coming after me. I kept imagining I saw movement in the shadows of the buildings. I don't know how long I walked. It felt like hours. The industrial area gave way to residential streets, but they were just as empty. Curtains were drawn, and the glow of Christmas trees was visible in some windows. I thought about knocking on a door, but I was afraid. What if he had somehow gotten ahead of me? What if he was waiting? Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a gas station. It was open, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. I practically ran towards it. Inside, there was one employee, a young guy who looked startled when I burst in. I must have looked a mess, disheveled, out of breath, wild-eyed. I quickly told him what had happened. that I had been kidnapped and needed help. He stared at me for a moment, probably trying to decide if I was crazy or telling the truth. But something in my voice or my eyes must have convinced him. He locked the door of the gas station and called the police. As we waited for them to arrive, he gave me a bottle of water and let me sit behind the counter with him. I was working late on Christmas Eve, finishing up some year-end reports. The office was practically empty, just me and the hum of the fluorescent lights. Outside, the sky was already dark, and I could see the first few snowflakes starting to fall. I was eager to get home, maybe catch the end of It's a Wonderful Life and have a glass of eggnog before bed. As I packed up my stuff and headed to the parking lot, I noticed how quiet everything was. The usual hustle and bustle of the city had died down, with most people already home for the holidays. My car was one of the few left in the lot, covered in a thin layer of fresh snow. I brushed off the snow and got in, cranking up the heat. The roads were pretty empty as I pulled out of the parking lot. I figured I'd make good time getting home. As I drove, I noticed how the streetlights reflected off the falling snow, creating a kind of surreal, peaceful atmosphere. About halfway home, I was driving down a stretch of road that cut through a wooded area. There weren't many streetlights here, and the trees on either side of the road made it feel darker and more isolated. That's when I saw her. There was a woman standing on the side of the road, waving her arms frantically. She was wearing a red coat that stood out against the snow, and even from a distance I could see the panic on her face. Her car was pulled over just behind her, hazard lights blinking. I slowed down, thinking she must have broken down or gotten stuck in the snow. It was Christmas Eve after all, and I couldn't just leave someone stranded out here in the cold. As I pulled over and started to roll down my window, I noticed something odd. The woman's car didn't look like it had any problems. There was no smoke coming from the engine, no flat tire, nothing that would explain why she'd stopped. Before I could process this, everything happened so fast. Two men suddenly appeared from behind the woman's car. They were dressed in dark clothes, and one of them had something in his hand that glinted in the light from my headlights. A knife. I didn't even have time to think. My body reacted on instinct. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, my tires spinning on the snow before finding traction. The car lurched forward just as one of the men reached for my door handle. I heard a thud as my side mirror clipped him, sending it flying off into the darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I sped down the road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the headlights of a car pulling out from where I'd stopped. They were coming after me. I pressed harder on the gas, watching the speedometer climb. The road was slick with snow, and my car fishtailed a couple of times as I took curves too fast. I was terrified of losing control, but even more terrified of what would happen if those men caught up to me. The headlights behind me grew larger as they gained ground. I realized with a sinking feeling that their car was faster than mine. I needed to find a way to lose them, and fast. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard, skidding onto the smaller road. It was unplowed and narrower, the snow deeper here. My car struggled through it, but I hoped the pursuing vehicle would have even more trouble. I was wrong. As I bounced and slid down this new road, the headlights stayed right on my tail. They were so close now that their high beams filled my car with light, making it hard to see where I was going. Suddenly, my tires hit a patch of ice. The car spun wildly, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to crash. Somehow, I managed to straighten out, but I'd lost precious distance. The other car was right behind me now. I could see houses on either side of the road now, but they all looked dark and empty. I laid on my horn as I sped past, hoping against hope that someone would hear, that someone would come out and see what was happening, but no lights came on. No one appeared. The road curved sharply, and as I took the turn, I felt a jolt. The pursuing car had hit my bumper. I struggled to keep control as they rammed me again. Each impact sent a shudder through my whole body. I knew if they hit me hard enough, they could run me off the road. In desperation, I made a hard right onto another street. My tires screamed in protest, and for a second, I thought I'd miscalculated. The car tilted dangerously, two wheels lifting off the ground before slamming back down. But I'd made the turn, and miraculously, the other car had been forced to overshoot. I used those precious few seconds to scan my surroundings. That's when I saw it. A police station, its lights on, just a few blocks away. Relief flooded through me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I floored it towards the station, but the other car had recovered and was gaining on me fast. They must have realized where I was heading because they were getting more aggressive. They rammed my car again, harder this time. I felt my head snap back against the headrest. The police station was so close now. I could see officers moving inside, unaware of the drama unfolding just down the street. I laid on my horn again, a long, continuous blast. The pursuing car hit me one last time, sending me spinning. I lost control, my car sliding sideways down the street. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the police station getting closer but sideways. I saw officers looking out the window, expressions of shock on their faces. I saw the other car speeding past me, the driver's face a blur as he realized it was too late to stop. My car slid to a stop right in front of the police station steps. Before I could even catch my breath, officers were rushing out, weapons drawn. I saw the other car speeding away, turning a corner and disappearing into the night. As an officer yanked open my door asking if I was okay, all I could do was nod. My hands were still gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers hurt when I tried to let go. Through the windshield, I could see more police cars pulling out, their sirens blaring as they gave chase to my attackers. I was driving to my sister's place on Christmas Day. She lives a few towns over, and I was running late because I'd spent too much time wrapping last-minute gifts. The main highway was packed with holiday traffic, so I decided to take a shortcut through some back roads I'd used before. It was mid-afternoon, but the sky was already getting dark. A light snow had started falling, dusting the road and the bare trees on either side. The back roads were completely empty. I hadn't seen another car since I'd turned off the highway. I was fiddling with the radio, trying to find a station that wasn't playing Christmas music, when I saw it. Up ahead, maybe 100 yards or so, there was a car off to the side of the road. It looked like it had skidded off into the ditch. I could see the rear end sticking up at an odd angle. As I got closer, I noticed there weren't any other tire tracks in the snow besides my own. This accident must have just happened. I slowed down, thinking maybe the driver needed help. It was freezing out and there was no cell service in these woods. If someone was hurt, they could be in real trouble. I pulled over about 20 feet behind the crashed car. The snow was coming down harder now and I had to squint to see clearly. The car's windows were fogged up, but I thought I could make out movement inside. I grabbed my phone even though I knew it wouldn't work and got out of my car. The cold hit me immediately. The wind had picked up, blowing snow into my face. I called out, asking if anyone needed help, but the wind carried my voice away. As I got closer to the car, I could see that the driver's side door was slightly open. I was about 10 feet from the car when the door suddenly swung open. A man stumbled out. He was hunched over, holding his side like he was injured. I rushed forward to help him, asking if he was okay. That's when everything went wrong. The man lunged at me with surprising speed. His hand clamped around my wrist with crushing force. I tried to pull away, but he was incredibly strong. As he straightened up, I got my first good look at his face. His eyes were wild, almost feral, and there was dried blood on his forehead. He started dragging me towards the woods, his grip so tight I thought my bones might snap. I dug my heels into the snow, trying to slow him down, but he just kept pulling. The trees loomed closer, dark and menacing. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, why this man I'd stopped to help was attacking me. As we reached the edge of the woods, the man turned slightly, and that's when I saw it. Under his open coat, he was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, the kind prisoners wear. In that moment, the reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't an accident victim. This was an escaped convict. Panic gave me a burst of strength. I planted my feet and yanked my arm back as hard as I could. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and his grip loosened just enough for me to break free. But he recovered quickly, spinning around and lunging at me again. I backpedaled, nearly losing my footing in the snow. He came at me, his hands outstretched, trying to grab me again. I dodged to the side, and he stumbled past me. Without thinking, I stuck out my foot, tripping him. He went down hard, face first into the snow. I turned and ran towards my car, my boots slipping on the icy ground. I could hear him behind me, his ragged breathing and the crunch of snow under his feet. My car seemed impossibly far away. Each step felt like I was running through molasses. Just as I reached for my car door, I felt his hand grab the back of my coat. He yanked hard, pulling me off balance. I slammed into the side of my car, the cold metal stinging my cheek. His other hand found my throat, squeezing tight. I couldn't breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. In desperation, I brought my knee up as hard as I could. It connected with something soft, and suddenly the pressure on my throat was gone. The man doubled over, gasping. I didn't waste a second. I wrenched open my car door and threw myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the man slammed into my driver's side window. His fist left a spiderweb of cracks in the glass. I threw the car into reverse, my tires spinning in the snow before finding traction. The man was still pounding on my window, screaming something I couldn't make out over the sound of my engine. I shifted into drive and floored it, my car fishtailing wildly before straightening out. In my rearview mirror, I could see the man running after my car. He quickly fell behind, becoming smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the swirling snow. But I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare go back to the main road. What if he had accomplices? What if there were roadblocks? My mind was spinning with terrifying possibilities. So I kept driving deeper into the back roads, taking random turns, just trying to put as much distance between me and that man as possible. I don't know how long I drove. The snow was falling heavily now, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of my car. Every shadow looked like a person. Every sound made me jump. I was lost, but I was too scared to stop and try to figure out where I was. Eventually, I saw lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station. It was the first sign of civilization I'd seen in what felt like hours. I pulled in, my car sliding a bit on the slush-covered pavement. The gas station looked closed, but there was a guy inside, probably the attendant. When he saw my car, he came to the door. I must have looked a mess because his eyes went wide when he saw me. He opened the door and asked if I was okay. I started to explain what had happened, the words tumbling out in a rush. The attendant's face grew more and more alarmed as I talked. When I finished, he immediately went to the phone behind the counter. I heard him talking, his voice low and urgent. A few minutes later, I heard sirens in the distance. As they got closer, the attendant turned on the small TV in the corner of the store. There was a news report playing. The image on the screen made my blood run cold. It was a mugshot of the man who had attacked me. The reporter was saying something about a prison break, multiple dangerous convicts on the loose in the area. As the first police car pulled into the gas station, its lights painting the falling snow in flashes of red and blue, I realized just how close I'd come to becoming another statistic in their report. The officers rushed in, their questions coming fast and urgent. I answered as best I could, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. I was driving to my parents' house for Christmas Eve dinner. It's about a 3-hour trip, and I'd left work a bit later than I planned. The sun was already setting as I hit the highway, casting long shadows across the road. At first, the drive was uneventful. Traffic was light, probably because most people had already reached their destinations. I had the radio on, half listening to Christmas songs and weather reports. They kept mentioning a winter storm warning, but the sky looked clear to me. About an hour into the drive, I noticed the temperature dropping. The dashboard thermometer showed it was below freezing now. I turned up the heat and kept driving. That's when I saw the first few snowflakes. It started slowly at first, just a light dusting. But within minutes, the snow was coming down hard. The wind picked up too, gusting across the road and reducing visibility. I slowed down, squinting to see through the swirling white. The highway was getting slicker by the minute. I could feel my tires struggling to grip the road. Other cars were pulling over, their hazard lights blinking in the gloom. I thought about doing the same, but I was already running late. I figured if I drove carefully, I could make it. That's when I saw the exit sign for a smaller state road. I knew it would take longer, but I thought it might be safer than the highway. So I took the exit, easing onto the smaller road. There were fewer cars here, and the trees on either side provided some shelter from the wind. For a while, it seemed like I'd made the right choice. The snow wasn't as heavy here, and I was able to maintain a steady speed. But as I drove deeper into the rural area, the storm intensified. The snow was falling so thick now that my headlights barely penetrated the white curtain in front of me. I was leaning forward in my seat, straining to see the road. When it happened, a curve came up faster than I expected. I tried to slow down, but as soon as I touched the brakes, I felt the car start to slide. I turned into the skid like I'd been taught, but it didn't help. The world outside the windshield became a blur of white and dark shapes. There was a sickening moment of weightlessness as the car left the road. Then came the impact. The car slid down an embankment, bouncing and jolting. I was thrown against my seatbelt, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Finally, with a harsh thud, the car came to a stop. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. The engine had stalled, and in the sudden silence, I could hear the wind howling outside. My hands were shaking as I unbuckled my seatbelt. I tried to open the door, but it was wedged shut. I had to roll down the window and climb out that way. The cold hit me like a physical blow. Snow immediately began to collect on my coat and hair. I trudged through the knee-deep snow around the car, assessing the damage. It was bad. The front end was crumpled against a tree, and even if I could get it unstuck, I doubted it would run. I climbed back into the car, brushing snow off my clothes. I tried to start the engine, but it just made a sad whining noise. My phone showed no signal. I was stuck, in the middle of nowhere in a worsening blizzard. I'm not sure how long I sat there, watching the snow pile up around the car. It could have been minutes or hours. The cold was seeping in, and I was starting to shiver. That's when I saw the headlights. A truck was making its way down the road, moving slowly through the storm. Relief washed over me. I scrambled out of the car, waving my arms and yelling for help. The truck slowed to a stop and a man got out. He was a big guy, bundled up in a heavy coat and hat. He shouted something about a tow rope, gesturing for me to get back in my car. I did, grateful for the shelter from the wind. I watched in my rearview mirror as he attached a rope to my back bumper. That's when things took a turn. Instead of getting back in his truck, the man came to my window. He was holding something in his hand. At first I thought it was a flashlight. Then I realized it was a gun. He told me to get out of the car. His voice was muffled by the wind, but the threat was clear. I hesitated, my mind racing. Maybe he just wanted my wallet. But as soon as I stepped out, he grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back. I tried to fight back, but he was much stronger. In the struggle, I slipped on the icy ground, falling face first into the snow. Before I could get up, I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Everything went dark. When I came to, I was in complete darkness. It took me a moment to realize where I was. The trunk of my own car. The space was cramped and cold. I could feel the rough carpet against my face and the spare tire pressing into my back. Panic set in. I started kicking and pounding on the trunk lid, yelling for help. But the storm must have muffled my cries. I could hear the wind howling outside and occasionally the creak of the car as it rocked in the gusts. I don't know how long I was in there. It felt like hours. The cold was intense, seeping into my bones. My fingers and toes went numb. I kept trying to find a way out, feeling around for a trunk release, trying to kick out the tail lights, but nothing worked. As time passed, my thoughts became muddled. I drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes I thought I heard voices or saw lights through the cracks of the trunk, but when I called out, there was no response. The worst part was not knowing what was happening. Had the man who attacked me left? Was he coming back? Was anyone looking for me? The uncertainty was almost as bad as the cold and the confinement. At some point, I became aware of a change. The howling of the wind had died down. The car wasn't rocking anymore. Had the storm passed? I started kicking and yelling again, with renewed energy. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps in snow. They were getting closer. I held my breath, unsure if it was my attacker returning or someone who could help. The footsteps stopped right next to the trunk. I heard voices muffled but clearly not just one person. Then came the sound of metal on metal. Someone was trying to open the trunk. I started yelling again, my voice hoarse from the cold and previous shouting. Suddenly, there was a rush of cold air as the trunk popped open. Light flooded in, so bright it hurt my eyes. I could make out the silhouettes of several people standing over me. One of them reached in asking if I was okay. As they helped me out of the trunk, I saw flashing lights. Police cars and an ambulance were parked on the road, their red and blue lights reflecting off the snow. Officers were examining my car and the surrounding area. I was led to the ambulance, where paramedics wrapped me in blankets and checked me over. As they worked, I could hear the officers talking. They mentioned finding an abandoned truck further down the road. Something about a string of similar incidents in the area. I was driving home late on Christmas night. The roads were mostly empty, just a few cars here and there. I'd spent the day with my family, but I had to work early the next morning, so I couldn't stay overnight like I usually do. The drive back is about 2 hours, mostly on dark country roads. At first, everything seemed normal. The radio was playing Christmas songs, and I was replaying moments from the day in my head. About an hour into the drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. It was pretty far back, so I didn't think much of it at first. As I continued driving, I realized the car behind me was getting closer. Much closer than necessary, especially given how empty the road was. I could see it was a dark-colored SUV, but I couldn't make out much else in the darkness. I figured maybe they were just in a hurry, so I moved over to let them pass. But they didn't. They just stayed right behind me, so close I could barely see their headlights in my mirror anymore. I started to feel uneasy. Why wouldn't they just pass? I sped up a little, thinking maybe they just weren't paying attention. The SUV sped up too, matching my pace exactly. Now I was starting to get worried. This didn't feel like normal traffic behavior. I decided to take the next exit even though it wasn't on my route. Maybe they were just heading the same way as me, and this would prove it. I took the exit, and sure enough, the SUV followed. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I realized this probably wasn't a coincidence. The exit led to a smaller, even darker road. There were no streetlights here, just my headlights illuminating the path ahead and the SUV's lights burning in my mirrors. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they were lost and hoping I knew where I was going. But as we drove further on this new road, that hope faded. Every turn I took, every speed change I made, the SUV mimicked perfectly. They were definitely following me. I considered calling the police, but when I picked up my phone, I saw I had no signal. Of course. These back roads were notorious for bad reception. I was on my own. I tried to think of what to do. I couldn't go home. That would lead them right to me. I needed to find somewhere public, somewhere with people. But at this time of night on Christmas, what would be open? Then I remembered a 24-hour gas station about 20 minutes ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option I had. I just had to make it there. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. The SUV stayed glued to my bumper the entire time. I kept checking my mirrors, trying to see who was driving, but their high beams made it impossible to see inside their vehicle. Finally, I saw the lights of the gas station in the distance. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the brightly lit parking lot. There was a single car at one of the pumps, and I could see an attendant inside the store. People, safety. I pulled up right in front of the store and was about to get out when I saw the SUV turn into the lot. Instead of pulling up to a pump, they drove directly towards me fast. Too fast. In a split second, I realized their intention. They weren't going to stop. I threw my car into reverse just as the SUV screeched to a halt, blocking me in. The driver's door flew open. Time seemed to slow down as I saw him get out. He was a large man dressed all in black, and in his hand, glinting in the fluorescent lights of the gas station, was a gun. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas. My tires squealed as I swerved around the SUV, clipping its front bumper. The impact jolted my whole car, but I kept going. I heard a loud bang, and my rear window shattered. He was shooting at me. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding out of the gas station and back onto the dark road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the SUV's headlights again. He was back in his vehicle and in pursuit. But now that I knew his intentions, fear was replaced by determination. I had to lose him. I took random turns down side streets, trying to shake him off. But he knew these roads too, matching every move I made. We were speeding through residential areas now, blowing past stop signs. I knew it was dangerous, but slowing down seemed even more deadly. I was running out of options and roads I knew. That's when I saw the signs for the highway. It was risky. The highway would be faster, but also harder to lose someone. But I was out of choices. I took the on-ramp at full speed, merging onto the empty highway. The SUV was right behind me. Now that we were on a straight road, he started to gain on me. My car was already at its limit, shuddering with the effort of maintaining such a high speed. Then, up ahead, I saw salvation. A police car was parked on the shoulder, probably watching for speeders. I'd never been so happy to see a cop in my life. As I approached the police car, I started honking my horn frantically. I could see the officer inside sit up, alert. I roared past him, still honking, and in my mirror, I saw his lights turn on. The SUV must have seen it too, because suddenly, it swerved across 3 lanes of highway and took an exit. The police car pulled out, siren blaring, but it was following me, not the SUV. I immediately slowed down and pulled over. As the officer approached my car, I could see the SUV's taillights disappearing in the distance. When the officer reached my window, words poured out of me in a rush, explaining what had happened. I watched as the officer radioed in the description of the SUV. More police cars went racing past us on the highway, in pursuit of my attacker. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what I'd just experienced started to sink in. The officer asked me to follow him to the police station to make a statement. As I drove behind the patrol car, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the image of the man with the gun, illuminated in the harsh lights of the gas station. I knew it would be a long time before I felt safe driving alone at night again. I was driving to meet my fiancé's family for the first time on Christmas Day. The highway stretched out before me, mostly empty except for a few other holiday travelers. The weather was clear, but a light dusting of snow covered the surrounding landscape, making everything look like a scene from a Christmas card. I'd been on the road for about 3 hours when I decided to take a break. My GPS showed a scenic overlook coming up, and I thought it would be a good place to stretch my legs and maybe take some photos to show my fiancé. I pulled into the parking area, which was empty except for my car. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in snow stretched out as far as I could see, with a frozen lake in the distance reflecting the pale winter sun. I spent a few minutes taking photos and enjoying the crisp air. It was peaceful. And I remember thinking how perfect everything seemed. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something wasn't right. There was a figure slumped against the passenger side door. At first, I thought maybe someone had broken down and was waiting for help. But as I got closer, I realized the person was in bad shape. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with disheveled hair and torn clothes. He was holding his side, and I could see blood seeping through his fingers. When he saw me approach, he lifted his head, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. He said he'd been in an accident and needed to get to a hospital. His voice was weak, and he was shivering violently. I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. I couldn't just leave him there in the cold, but something about the situation felt off. Still, I couldn't ignore someone who clearly needed help. I helped him into the passenger seat of my car. He was unsteady on his feet, and I had to practically lift him in. As I walked around to the driver's side, I pulled out my phone to call for an ambulance, but there was no signal. I figured I'd drive until I got reception and then call for help. As soon as I started the car, the man's demeanor changed. His voice became stronger, more commanding. He told me to drive and not to try anything stupid. When I turned to look at him, I saw he was holding a makeshift knife. It looked like a sharpened piece of metal, maybe from a bed frame or something similar. That's when he told me the truth. He had escaped from a nearby correctional facility and needed to get as far away as possible. The injury was real. He'd hurt himself during the escape, but it wasn't life-threatening. He made it clear that if I didn't do exactly what he said, I'd end up with a lot worse than his injury. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. Just minutes ago, I'd been taking photos of a winter wonderland, and now I was being held at knife point by an escaped convict. I wanted to believe it was some sort of nightmare, but the cold metal pressed against my side was all too real. He instructed me to take back roads, avoiding main highways. I did as he said, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. We drove for what felt like hours, the scenery changing from snow-covered fields to dense forests. The whole time, he kept the makeshift knife trained on me, watching my every move. As we drove, he talked about his plans. He needed to get to a specific town where he said he had connections who could help him disappear. I tried to keep him talking, hoping to build some kind of rapport, but he was too focused on watching for any signs of police activity. We passed through small towns, each one making my heart race. I kept hoping someone would notice something was wrong, but to anyone looking in, we probably just looked like two people on a holiday road trip. The normality of the scenes outside, families gathered in homes, kids playing with new toys in front yards, made the terror inside my car feel even more surreal. At one point, we approached a police checkpoint. I saw it in the distance, flashing lights and officers stopping cars. For a moment, I thought this might be my chance for rescue. But before we got close, the man forced me to turn onto a dirt road. We bumped along the uneven path, branches scraping the sides of my car, until we were well past the checkpoint. As the day wore on, my captor grew more agitated. The pain from his injury seemed to be getting worse, and he was constantly looking over his shoulder. He'd make me change directions randomly, paranoid that we were being followed. I tried to think of ways to alert someone without him noticing. When we'd stop for gas, I'd try to make eye contact with the attendants, silently pleading for help. But with the knife always just out of sight, I couldn't risk doing anything obvious. At one gas station, I managed to leave a hastily scrawled note in the bathroom, hoping someone would find it and alert the authorities. But as we drove away, I had no way of knowing if it had been discovered or if help was on the way. The hours blended together. We'd been driving for so long that I was starting to lose track of where we were or how much time had passed. My eyes were heavy from the stress and constant vigilance, but the adrenaline and fear kept me alert. As night began to fall, we entered a more populated area. The man seemed to recognize where we were and became more animated. He started giving more specific directions, guiding me through a maze of suburban streets. Finally, he told me to pull over near a park. It was dark now and the park was empty. He said this was where he was meeting his contact. I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this ordeal was finally coming to an end. But as we sat there waiting, with no sign of anyone else, I started to worry. What if there was no contact? What would he do with me once he didn't need me to drive anymore? That's when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror. A police car was approaching slowly, probably on a routine patrol. The man saw it too and immediately tensed up. He grabbed me by the collar, pulling me close, the knife pressing harder against my side. In that moment, I knew I had to act. As the police car drew closer, I suddenly threw the car into drive and slammed on the gas. The sudden movement caught my captor off guard. He lost his grip on the knife, and it fell to the floor. I swerved the car wildly, hoping to attract the officer's attention. My captor was yelling, trying to regain control, but I kept driving erratically. I could see the police car's lights go into full emergency mode in my mirror. In his desperation, the man tried to grab the steering wheel. We struggled, the car veering dangerously across the road. I saw a chain-link fence approaching fast. In a split-second decision, I hit the brakes hard and turned sharply. The car spun, the tires screeching on the pavement. We came to a stop just inches from the fence. Before my captor could react, I threw open my door and tumbled out onto the cold ground. I could hear the police cars skidding to a halt nearby, doors opening, and voices shouting. I scrambled away from the car, my hands raised. The officers approached cautiously, weapons drawn. I tried to explain what had happened, pointing at my car where the man was still inside. As the officers moved in to apprehend him, the reality of what I'd just been through began to sink in. The adrenaline that had kept me going for hours started to wear off, leaving me shaking and disoriented. One of the officers approached me, asking if I was okay. I nodded, unable to find words. As they led my former captor away in handcuffs, I stood there, watching, still trying to process how my Christmas day had turned into this nightmare. I was driving home on Christmas Eve after visiting my grandparents in rural Minnesota. The sun had set about an hour ago and the temperature was dropping fast. I could see my breath fogging up the windshield, even with the heater on full blast. The roads were getting icy and I had to keep a firm grip on the steering wheel to keep my car from sliding. I'd been on the highway for a while, but traffic was moving slow because of the weather. I remembered a shortcut my grandfather had mentioned, a back road that could shave off at least 30 minutes from my trip. I figured it was worth a try, especially since I wanted to get home before it got too late. I took the next exit and found myself on a narrow 2-lane road. There were no streetlights, just the glow of my headlights illuminating the path ahead. The trees on either side of the road were thick, their branches heavy with snow. It was beautiful in a way, but also eerie. I hadn't seen another car since I'd left the highway. About an hour into this new route, I started to regret my decision. The road seemed to go on forever, winding through the dark forest. My GPS was struggling to maintain a signal, and I was starting to worry I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. That's when I first noticed something was wrong with my car. There was a faint rattling sound coming from the engine. At first I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the cold making the car act up. But as I drove on, the sound got louder and more persistent. Suddenly the engine made a loud clanking noise, and the car started to lose power. I pressed the gas pedal harder, but it was no use. The car was slowing down and I barely had time to pull over to the side of the road before it died completely. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine just made a weak whining sound. It wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but nothing happened. Realizing I was stuck, I pulled out my phone to call for help. That's when I saw I had no signal, not even one bar. I got out of the car, thinking maybe I could get a signal if I walked around a bit. The cold hit me like a wall as soon as I opened the door. The wind was picking up, blowing snow into my face. I walked up and down the road, holding my phone up, trying to get even the faintest signal. Nothing. I couldn't see any lights in the distance, no signs of houses or other cars. I was completely alone. I got back in the car trying to figure out what to do. I knew it wasn't safe to stay in a broken-down car in this weather, but walking seemed even more dangerous. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town, and with the temperature dropping, I could freeze before I found help. I decided to wait for a while, hoping another car would come by. I kept the doors locked and turned the key to the accessory position so I could run the heater occasionally without draining the battery too much. I watched the road, straining my eyes for any sign of headlights. I'm not sure how long I sat there. It felt like hours. The cold was seeping into the car and I was shivering despite my heavy coat. I was just about to give up and try walking when I saw it. A faint glow in my rearview mirror. Headlights. Relief washed over me. I got out of the car, waving my arms, trying to flag down the approaching vehicle. As it got closer, I could see it was an old van, probably from the 80s or 90s. It was rusty and beat up looking, but at that moment, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The van slowed to a stop behind my car. 2 men got out. They were both tall and heavyset, wearing thick winter coats. Something about them made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was just grateful for any help. They asked what had happened, and I explained about my car breaking down. They nodded, looking at my car and then back at me. One of them said I couldn't stay here, that a storm was coming and it wasn't safe. He insisted I come with them, that they could take me to the nearest town. I hesitated. Something in the back of my mind was screaming that this was wrong. Their eyes were too intense, their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. I told them I'd rather wait with my car, that surely a tow truck would come soon. That's when things took a turn. The larger of the two men stepped closer to me. He said I didn't understand, that I had to come with them. His voice was different now, harder. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. In that moment, pure terror shot through me. I reacted on instinct, wrenching my arm free and shoving him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, surprise on his face. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran. I sprinted into the woods beside the road, branches whipping at my face as I ran. I could hear them shouting behind me, their heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning in the cold air. I had no idea where I was going. Everything looked the same in the dark, just trees and snow. I could still hear them behind me getting closer. I veered to the right, hoping to throw them off. My foot caught on a root and I fell, tumbling down a small slope. I landed in a small clearing, the wind knocked out of me. For a moment I lay there, gasping for air. Then I heard their voices, closer now. I scrambled to my feet and looked around frantically. There was a large fallen tree nearby, its roots creating a small hollow underneath. Without thinking, I dove into the space beneath the tree. It was a tight fit, and the ground was freezing. But I pushed myself as far back as I could. I tried to control my breathing, terrified they would hear me. I could see their flashlight beams sweeping through the trees. They were so close. I could hear them talking, saying they knew I was nearby, that I couldn't hide forever. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to muffle the sound of my breathing. They searched for what felt like hours. Sometimes their voices would fade, only to come back louder than before. I stayed perfectly still, ignoring the cold and the cramping in my muscles. At one point, one of them walked right past my hiding spot. I could see his boots, just inches from my face. I closed my eyes, certain I was about to be found. But he moved on. Gradually, their voices grew more distant. I heard them calling to each other, saying they should head back, that I must have gotten away. Still, I didn't move. I waited, listening intently for any sound of their return. Finally, after what must have been at least an hour of silence, I heard the distant sound of an engine starting. The van. They were leaving. Even then, I waited longer, terrified it might be a trick. When I couldn't stand the cold anymore, I slowly crawled out from under the tree. My entire body was stiff and I could barely feel my fingers and toes. I listened carefully but heard nothing except the wind in the trees. I made my way back towards the road, moving as quietly as I could. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I almost cried with relief. The van was gone. I ran to my car, fumbling with frozen fingers to get the key in the lock. Once inside, I just sat there for a moment, shaking. I knew I couldn't stay, but I was afraid to try starting the car in case the noise attracted attention. Finally, desperation won out. I turned the key, praying it would start. To my amazement, the engine roared to life. Whatever had been wrong with it earlier seemed to have fixed itself. Maybe it had just been the cold. I didn't question it. I put the car in drive and took off, driving as fast as I dared on the icy roads. I didn't slow down until I saw signs for a town. When I finally saw the lights of a police station, I felt like I could breathe again. I pulled into the parking lot and rushed inside, the words tumbling out of me as I tried to explain what had happened to the startled officer at the desk. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.